Welcome in to the first episode of The Hawks Eye with me, Bryce Coots. I know I've been on the Hawk Zone rundown, guys, and that was a great run for me over there, but now it's time for me to do my own thing, and that's exactly what this channel is going to be about. It is me solo running this. We'll have some great guest hosts come on, like Mookie Alexander and Michael Thompson at different points throughout the week, but you will see more of me more frequently. This is going to be as close to a daily content show as I can produce. We're going to have different themed episodes throughout the week, and we're going to have a lot of live shows. We'll have live watch parties. We will have live post and pre-game shows talking all things Seattle Seahawks. And guys, I am lucky enough to have on my first show, Jeff Simmons is going to be joining me in a few minutes here to discuss the Seattle Seahawks season, what he's expecting, what is he expecting in this last game coming up with the Green Bay Packers, who does he think's on the roster bubble, guys that maybe we have thought of that were safe, aren't safe anymore in Jeff's mind. We're also going to discuss Klint Kubiak. What does this offense look like? And obviously the most important piece, Sam Darnold and these quarterbacks. Everyone's excited about what Jalen Milroe's been doing. Everyone's excited, what Sam did in his first drive against the Kansas City Chiefs. But what does this mean for the future of that position in Seattle? So all of that is going to be coming up next. And guys, I cannot stress enough to you, please help me out with this. It's a new channel, so I'm starting from ground zero. Please like, subscribe, share this show with as many fellow Seahawks fans as you can. You will see me on a bunch of different shows like the Seahawks Syndicate show that's going to come out in a few weeks here. But guys, honestly, help me out. Subscribe, like the channel, share the channel, comment. I want to engage with all of you guys. I'm so looking forward to doing that. So guys, right after this, we've got Jeff Simmons. All right, everyone. Welcome back into the Hawks Eye. I've got Jeff Simmons joining me today from Real Hawk Talk. Jeff's a fellow Canadian Seahawk fan and analyst, so it's great to finally be able to connect and kind of bridge the, I guess it would be the two sides of the coast of the Seahawk fandom in Canada here, Jeff, with you being in Ontario and me being out here on the West Coast. But Jeff, tell my listeners a little bit about yourself.
I'm a bit of a probably an untypical guy you see in the Seahawks Twitter space, and my dad was a pretty big hockey columnist in Canada, and he's now like a national sports columnist. And a lot of people I know from Seahawks Twitter would probably not like his style of writing. He's a very like American style. In Canada, most people know him, and I grew up around the sports industry. Like I used to travel with the local hockey team when I was like 6 years old, stuff like that. And my dad always told me, okay, don't go into sports. There's no money in it. Become a lawyer, get a degree. And me, like every other kid, didn't listen to their parents. And right out of school, I went and got a job at TSN. You would know TSN. I don't know how many of our listeners would know. And I ended up getting a job at Sportsnet from there. And I actually spent 7 years kind of writing for Sportsnet. And I became a Seahawks fan like when I was in high school. So I have a lot of family out in Vancouver, and a lot of them moved back to Toronto, but I didn't know any other Seahawks fans. So just through Twitter, I got to know different people because, again, in Toronto, everyone I know likes a different team. And over the years, I've actually gotten to know some more. I know like 4 or 5 in Toronto that I run into, but not a good like group I talk with. And then Brian, who runs our show, I don't know how I can't remember how we came across paths, and asked me if I ever wanted to like write for them as a blog. And when I was working at Sportsnet, they told me I couldn't do anything outside of the Rogers family. And again, if you're American, you're not going to know what the hell I'm talking about right now, but it's the equivalent of like the ESPN or a Fox in Canada. And so they're owned by the company that owns the Toronto Blue Jays, and they're very particular with what you can do. So I ended up leaving for a totally different line of work. I think my dad ended up being right. And I said, like, hey, why don't we do something? And that's where kind of Real Hawk Talk started. And now over the years, it's just I've gone to know more Seahawks fans. We're doing our shows every week. Brian's now full-time into this, which is crazy. He was like a big deal at Adobe. And it's been really, really cool just getting to know so many people. I've been able to get out to Seattle a couple times since I've gotten to know everyone, probably 3 or 4 games in the last 7 years, I think, since we started our show. And yeah, so I was fully expecting to go in and be a media guy. In Canada, hockey is everything. And I played hockey growing up. I still watch it, but I grew up, hockey was probably my number one sport. But as I got older and I started playing Madden, I think I started playing Madden in high school, I fell in love with the NFL and everything about it. And then when I was writing at Sportsnet, I couldn't really connect with a lot of people because I was so into like the draft and they looked at me like I was crazy. And so it's been really cool to get to know all these people who are like me out there, because everyone here I know is big hockey, big Blue Jays, big basketball. Everyone has their own football teams, but it's not like when I talk to a lot of people. So that was a bit of a rant, but yeah, that's really my background.
No, it's all good, Jeff. And the funny thing is what you're talking about with Sportsnet and TSN. I totally appreciate that, because the worst thing for me growing up is I fell in love with football. We have the CFL up here, obviously. So I grew up kind of going to Lions games and stuff. One of the first football games I actually went to was a preseason game between the Seahawks and the 49ers in BC Place, which was kind of a cool thing way back when. And I fell in love with the NFL at that point. But the problem was the same kind of thing. You couldn't get enough content, even though the Seahawks were so close. It was kind of like, okay, how do I watch this? I could only watch. And at that point, the Seahawks weren't great. So it was more like I was watching with my dad, like the Raiders and the 49er games, because they were better teams. So that's what we were getting on the West Coast. So yeah, no, I totally understand what you're talking about. And it would be like for our listeners, like living in Texas and basically not being allowed to write anything about like the Dallas Cowboys or Houston Texans as an equivalent, essentially.
Exactly.
So, yeah, no, man. And obviously what you do with Brian and that whole crew over there at Real Hawk Talk's awesome. It's something I literally watched for years before I started my own channel and everything. So this is kind of a really cool thing to kind of full circle it for myself. But let's kind of get into some topics here. So first one I want to ask you, Sam Darnold's preseason debut for one, and like the expectations you have for, I'd say, the quarterback position going forward in Seattle, not just for this year, but kind of the outlook of it. Since Russ's trade, they kind of went through the Geno Smith years where it was kind of like, well, what does the bridge look like? Like, what's the next thing? And then obviously this year they draft Jalen Milroe. Now the question becomes, is Jalen Milroe the next thing, with Sam Darnold holding down the fort for now? So what do you make of the entirety of Sam Darnold's preseason that you've seen so far, and then the whole quarterback position?
Yeah, well, when they got Darnold, and I was actually, I don't know how I came across this, but the night Geno got traded, we did a live show, and I was saying the whole thing was connected to Darnold, and they were looking at me like I was crazy, and it really played out once we got like the full context. But when that happened, even so, I kind of looked at Darnold as a placeholder, and I never thought of him as like they're making their bet as a franchise quarterback. Maybe I know like Albert Breer's done a couple stories of maybe he's found himself now. I don't think I'm there yet. I still kind of see him as essentially a younger version of what they had before with Geno. And I'm not saying him and Geno are the same kind of player. I know there's a lot of metrics that will indicate Geno's better, but I mean, like, they have a quarterback who's pretty good potentially, but they're not like one of those franchise quarterbacks like we had with Russ all those years and what the Bills have and the Ravens have. At some point, the Seahawks are going to need one of those guys. And hope, again, I don't know if that's Darnold. I don't know if that's Milroe, but seeing the first preseason action we got to see from him last week, I think my like initial indications were pretty accurate, but I was kind of struck with how the offense looked and just how low the degree of difficulty was for the quarterback. And you've seen Matt Schaub be a Pro Bowler in this offense, and you've seen Jimmy Garoppolo take a team to the Super Bowl in this offense. And you saw what happened to both those guys once they left the scheme. They both fell off a cliff right away. And Jimmy G is now back in the scheme with McVay as a backup, and Matt Schaub completely fell off the face after Richard Sherman kind of picked him. But the degree of difficulty isn't huge if they're running the offense we saw last weekend. And so I know, like, I got into on Twitter with a former Seattle radio guy. I was like, you guys are so arrogant. You got Sam Darnold. I'm like, I don't think the quarterback is that important to what they're going to do this year. And I think this year is more setting up the infrastructure of the offense, kind of what they did last year on defense. Look, ideally Sam Darnold really hits and they got something going for the next 5 years. He's a young player. I know, like, Albert Breer put out that story of like he's finally found himself, and But I think after the way Darnold ended the season, and I think you obviously got to be a little skeptical. In the ideal world for the Seahawks, Jalen Milroe hits. But again, we've only seen him play against third string players and with third string players. You're going to see a lot of them tomorrow or Saturday, whenever this goes. But I think obviously think what McDonald was with in Baltimore, and you have the dominant run game, the dominant defense with a quarterback that can add to that. That's a really powerful team. But again, Milroe is such a project, and he's really improved at some things I didn't know that he was capable of. But in the ideal sense, he hits. I'd say the odds of it are pretty low. But I think they took Geno, who was an older player that had almost too high of a floor in terms of you're kind of stuck. And you got 2 shots here. And if it doesn't work, you got to keep drafting them. So I think they've actually put themselves in a pretty advantageous position. They found a guy, because this could have got really bad had Darnold, say, went to Pittsburgh and they're chasing Aaron Rodgers or Justin Fields. And he mentioned Drew. It might have been Drew Lock. I think that was the story. So this could have got really bad. And I think they end up in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you on the sense that I don't know what Darnold is yet. Like, I went to training camp, I went to the Fan Fest. I got to see him actually, perform in this, kind of offense the way it's structured, and we saw what we saw against Kansas City. I think it's very much to your point. This offense is so QB friendly because you take almost half the responsibility of the pre-snap process off a quarterback's plate with having the center make all the line adjustments and line calls, which we know with Ryan Grubb last year, Geno was doing a lot of that. He was making a lot of the checks and stuff. And that's what goes back to Klint Kubiak's statement, I think, when he first got hired, when he was, I think it was on KJR or 710, he made the comment that I kind of need an elite center. Like, the system needs an elite center and a smart center. And so I think with the fact that you take that off the quarterback's plate, and now it's really reading the linebackers to the secondary, or however you want to say it, vice versa, it makes it a lot easier to play fast in this offense. And I think that's where, to your point again, Matt Schaub had a Pro Bowl season. We've seen Jimmy G have a Pro Bowl season and lead a team to a Super Bowl. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens when that run game doesn't necessarily function as perfectly as it did the last 2 games, and when a little bit more is put on Darnold's plate to win a game. And, to the end of the season last year, I'll say this, the Detroit game, I think, was more damning than the Rams game. And the reason I say the Rams game I don't think was nearly as damning is when you watch the All-22, like, the concepts that Kevin O'Connell was calling weren't helping Darnold in any form or shape, especially when you got Jared Verse and Brandon Fisk destroying your offensive line. You don't have any semblance of a run game. And he wasn't throwing picks. He was hanging on to the ball too long, which isn't any better. But when you look at the Detroit game, for me, that was the game that stood out where I went, okay, here's some chinks in that armor of your perfect season, quote unquote, for Sam Darnold. And it's things he'll have to definitely overcome, I think, this year for sure. And then to the Jalen Milroe point you made, like, we've never really seen a quarterback with the issues that Milroe has really come into the league and, like, flip that switch, I guess is the way I'd look at it. The only one I could really point to is maybe Josh Allen. Because when Josh Allen came in, his delivery and everything from Wyoming was a huge thing. He was a 50% or 55% completion guy coming out of college. He wasn't really great. And then you saw him for those first 3 years. Yeah, he's a great athlete, but you never really saw the passer, and he slowly developed into what he is now, which is an MVP level quarterback. But that's one guy out of how many years the NFL has had quarterbacks in drafting and development. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens with Miller. I've seen improvement, but again, I agree with you. Like, you're talking about a guy that's played against 3rd and 4th strings when teams aren't really game planning. It's more about evaluation. No one's really planning for his legs and what Seattle's going to do. And a lot of what Seattle does when he's in there is more gun-based stuff than it is under center, which, again, isn't really a staple of the Kubiak offense. So I think the way that they handle this by also putting Drew Lock as that, I guess, extra layer in the QB room might be the smartest move John Schneider made with the quarterback room this offseason, is not allowing Milroe to be the next guy up.
Yeah, and a lot of people are pretty upset about Lock and the fact that he's kind of eating into Milroe's preseason time. But I was thinking about it the other day, and I agree with you. I think the best thing for Milroe is to really take your time and really try to develop him. And again, it's a dart throw. It's a 3rd round pick. When we were going through the draft stuff and they had Kubiak in, I was like, they're not going to draft Milroe. He doesn't fit the offense at all. And then I figured he'd be a 2nd round pick because of that running ability. And at the end of the 3rd round, it was definitely worth the dart throw. It's a free, like, I can't think of anyone who went after that I was upset they didn't pick. So, but Yeah, I think having Locke just allows him to take his time. I think Locke is a really good kind of mentor for him. But even so, it's just if Darnold gets hurt or he can't play a game, I don't think you want to throw this kid in there and mess him up. Because look what's going on with Anthony Richardson right now, who was the 4th overall pick, and obviously different kind of player, but raw, developmental, and it's just been so clunky, and they've messed him up. And just having Locke, at least they really have a strong QB room. It works. The 1, 2, 3 all makes sense. I know a lot of people want to see Milrow as the 2, and they trade Locke or cut Locke. I don't think that makes sense yet. I don't think it's what you want. This guy is a very raw player. And like you said, the odds it hits, there's not really a lot of precedent for it.
Yeah, and the thing for me, so I'm going to ask you kind of this hypothetical situation. I want to see where your head goes with this, Jeff, is say Darnold really struggles. Like we're seeing like New York Jet, Sam Darnold, somehow, some way, hypothetical situation. We're going into that offseason, but Milrow's not ready to take over yet. Is this then become a run it back with Sam, do you think? Or do they pivot to somebody else as a starter for a year, considering where this defense is at, where the rest maybe say it's like maybe the O-line is fine and the run game does work, but Sam still just has a bad year and kind of regresses. What do you think that would look like for Seattle? Do you think it would be a move off Sam, or do you think it would be a roll it back again and try again kind of thing, especially if Milrow's not ready?
Yeah, I think they would move off him. I don't think people would like the answer, but I think Drew Lock might be the guy they would turn to. And Mike Silver did a story on Darnold, what I think was the best story I've read on Darnold. And I don't subscribe to The Athletic. I have a way to get through their paywall. So if anyone wants to know, let me know. I have a way around it. But sorry, Michael Sean, I'm not trying to. But he wrote this story on Darnold like 2 months ago. And what I like when Mike Silver reads something, he's very connected with like the top end executives. He clearly sat down with Schneider, and Schneider told him, and he didn't quote him directly, but it's clearly that they looked at 3 options once Geno got traded. The 3 options were Darnold, and they were worried that Darnold was going to go somewhere else. The other option was Aaron Rodgers, but there was a lot of people just uncomfortable that he wanted to take that. The third option was Drew Lock, who they ended up signing. So John Schneider still has the soft spot for him that, frankly, I don't think is warranted. But he did look pretty competent in the preseason, and we saw a bad pick. But I think in the system, I think if they considered that they were going to start him this year, I think they would just go to him and try to develop Milrow another year, and fans would hate it. But again, if Darnold stinks to the point where they're drafting pretty high, that could change the whole equation.
Well, especially with this quarterback class that's supposed to be coming in, right? They could really change that equation when you're talking about Drew Allar, Klint Kubiak, you got Greg Garrett Nussmeier, you got Sellers, you got all these potential. And I know everyone wants to throw Archie Manning in that conversation. I don't think Arch Manning's actually coming out, to be honest. From what I've heard, I think he's going to stay another year, probably at Texas at least. But let's pivot here, Jeff, to another part of this offense and the offensive line. And the key word I put in there is progress, because I think we can actually say this offensive line has had some progress from where it's been. What are your thoughts on what you've seen so far from this offensive line and read about and heard from the beat reporters and stuff like that? Like, do you think it's really made progress, or do you think it's kind of this mirage because it's preseason?
It's the hardest thing going through my mind right now, because every part of me wants to get excited about it. At the very least, they look like they're competent. And I haven't said that about many Seahawks offensive lines really since there was like a stretch with Mike Upati and Dwayne Brown and some of those guys where they looked, but this looks like what the wide zones coach to look like. And Gray Zabel has looked fantastic. But yeah, I was blown away last Friday at just how good they looked, how well coached it is. I know a lot of people were excited about John Benton, but they had so many young players. I was wondering what this is going to look like. And Charles Cross hasn't been playing in the preseason. So, yeah, look, you cannot have been excited by what you saw as them as run blocking. The question I still think is what happens when they get in the obvious drop back situations. Can they hold up in pass pro? And I haven't been at training camp. I've heard Zabel's been mixed in, but I think if they can stay on schedule and they can run the ball, I don't think there's any way they're going to be a bottom 5 offensive line. Like a lot of people would have thought. You couldn't not watch that game, and the amount of like national people that have all of a sudden come out and been like, wow, the Seahawks offense looked pretty good. And now all of a sudden, like, there's just been a shift because again, watching that team run block and Anthony Bradford's a guy when some people said he might win the right guard job. I want to throw up in my mouth because he was one of the worst players I'd watched in the whole league the last 2 years. He looked out of shape. He was taking down penalties. And I was under the impression, I heard Brett Coleman say this, and I keep referencing all these guys, but I thought Christian Haynes is going to be pretty good in the system. And I said that as a bold take. I thought he'd be good. And I was pretty bummed out that he didn't seem to win the job, but I don't know if it's going to matter. If Zabel looks as good, I think Zabel is going to have a bit of a learning curve once the real games start. And he's playing against, but they've seen Max Crosby, and you've seen a lot of the Chiefs starters. I don't know if the offensive line will be great, but I think there's a pretty good case they're going to be a really good run blocking line this year. And I think the big thing is obviously Lucas's health, but he looks fantastic. So Zabel, I heard Daniel Jeremiah say this week, that outside of Abdul Carter, Gray Zabel has been the best rookie he's seen in the preseason so far. And again, you have to throw the obvious caveat on everything I just said, that it's preseason. So the two sides of my brain are fighting each other, but I was giddy watching the offensive line just dominate on the ground like that. And that's really the style of what Mike McDonald wants the team to look like offensively. That's what Michigan looks like. That's what Baltimore has looked like so many of these years. And I've always been jealous. I know everyone loves the big passing teams. I think my ultimate style of football was the smash mouth, just beat you up and then play action over the top. And the interesting thing is the flaw of this scheme historically has been with the Shanahans is they don't have a lot of power. They can zone block you, they can catch you off balance. When they get into pure, they think of the Niners guards over the years with Shanahan. They haven't had a lot of powerful guards. They can get pushed around by teams. But if you have Zabel, Lucas, and Bradford, that's an amazing amount of power and talent. And it might kind of cover up one of the biggest flaws of this scheme historically. So every part of me was excited watching those guys play. I don't know what's real yet. Obviously, when the regular season comes on, it's going to be so interesting because the Niners have so many young players on their D-line, and they play them the first week. And if they could just run block, that could be. But just seeing what they did to the Chiefs, I don't know. Chris Jones was out. But if you weren't encouraged by that, I just don't know what to say anymore.
The thing for me, the word that kind of popped into my head when I was watching the Raiders game, obviously, which we saw it start to develop, and they did run the ball well in that game. And then really what I saw in the Chiefs game for me was it was the first time I looked at a Seattle offensive line and went, they are bullying another team in the trenches. They're not getting bullied. And it was weird because you're sitting there and you're going, most of the time we give the ball to our back and he's making some guy miss 3 yards in the backfield just to get back to the line of scrimmage. And it was the first run to Charbonnet versus the Chiefs. He goes for 12 yards, straight down the pipe. And I'm like, we actually moved people. We enforced our will on somebody and moved them and got them going and just went down the field. And then that second touchdown drive with Bobo's screen, slot screen catch and score, 8 of those plays were runs. And you went from your own side of the field down the field. And so it's just, to your point, it's extremely encouraging. And I'm in the same boat you are. I'm like, do I really dive in and grab hold of this and believe it's really going to be a thing? We're going to have that mentality back. I think another key point to this is the center position. Jalen Sundell looks like he could really solve that potentially for Seattle, which is something, again, we've had the curse of Max Unger since we made the trade almost a decade ago. I just call it the Max Unger curse now. It's just what I refer to it as. And then you look at Robbie Oots. I think having a fullback back in this system makes a huge difference. And especially a fullback, nothing against Nick Ballore and some of the other guys they had, like Will Tukawafu and stuff, but a viable athletic option to catch the ball out of the backfield and do something with it. We've seen 2 plays already from Oots this preseason where he just kind of leaks out and he's by himself and he turns it into a 10+ yard gain. We haven't really seen that since Max Strong and Leonard Weaver, really, where we had a viable receiving threat from our fullback. And I know I'm pulling names from way back, but that's really how long it's been since you've seen a functioning offense like this in Seattle, I think.
Yeah, I thought Oots was maybe the best player on the field the first preseason game against the Raiders, which I think he played 8 plays and it's a fullback. So when I said that on my show, some people looked at me like I was insane, but I think the way he just dominated the game and his physical presence and his athleticism was shocking to me to see. I figured a guy who's a tight end, there's going to be a learning curve, and it's cool seeing Mike Robb on the broadcast, and he's clearly talking to him and coaching him, and You can see how giddy he is, but he looks like he has the ceiling of an all-pro level fullback. And again, it's an all-pro fullback. We don't know how much that means, but when we did our free agent preview last year and we were going through positions, and I said the guy I hope they really signed was Patrick Ricard, who was the fullback from Baltimore, who was with McDonald. Probably not the best fit for the Shanahan scheme, but the Shanahan scheme has used Kyle Juszczyk for all these years, who's more athletic, and he's not the power guy, but he's been a really creative chess piece for them. And look, I'm getting ahead of myself, but Oots has parts of both of those guys. He kind of has the size of Ricard with the athleticism. And again, if you get the best of both those players, that's like a all-pro every year. I don't know if that's going to happen, but you can see the impact of him. Like, there's so many running plays in those first two games where it's just he's making such a big difference to what the run game is, and it really just shows the identity of how they want to play this year. And I think getting him was a huge part of the rookie class I didn't even consider. And again, everyone who's watching those first two games had to be struck by how good he looked.
Well, and that's the thing when I look at when they do put Oots in the game and you've got two tight ends on the field and one receiver, really you have three tight ends because of his background there, and you can do things with him as not a traditional fullback necessarily can do, and vice versa. If you're in, a situation where you have two receivers, a tight end, and a fullback, well, now you could be theoretically in a 12 personnel and you just slide him over and now you're in a 12 because he can line up as a tight end. Like, he's such an interesting chess piece to this offense. We talk about, what are they going to do with Jalen Milroe and all the options they can do with him. It's kind of a cool thing to be like, what can they do with Robbie Oots in this? Because yes, they have three tight ends in Saubert and Barner and Arroyo, who we haven't even talked about yet. But now we're talking about basically you're getting a fourth tight end with the fullback capability. It's like the Swiss Army knife with the size of one of the better fullbacks in the league and the versatility of one of the other best fullbacks in the league. It could be really interesting. What's your take on the center position, though, Jeff? Like, how do you think this goes after what you've seen Jalen Sundell put on tape and put on the field in this preseason? And you can even count a little bit of that Green Bay game we saw him last year, and what you've seen from Olu, and obviously now Olu's injured and now he's come back from it. How do you think this shapes up in the next, 24 hours, because they will play their final preseason game?
Last year, like, we saw a small glimpse of him, and I thought Sundell looked remarkably solid just from a guy who was an undrafted free agent from a small school. And when he had to come in there, it wasn't a lot of snaps, but he caught my attention. And every year, John Schneider goes, we got these young players that no one knows about. They're pretty good. And you think about it, can you think of one of those guys that's actually hit? I can't think of any that he talks about, and none of them ever hit. But deep down, I was kind of hoping they were going to draft Jared Wilson or one of those guys. But once we kind of got past that, I was hoping he would win the job. And I just liked his athleticism and his upside. And I thought Olu's a fine center. He's smart. I figured Olu would just win because of his intelligence and what you said earlier about the Kubiak offense. But watching these guys get out into space and get to the second level, and for what they can do, and Zabel was a 90th percentile athlete, and that's why everyone was so excited about him. And Bradford, for his issues, was a crazy athlete when he got drafted. And Lucas and Cross are really athletic. Sundell is just a way better athlete than Olu. And considering how cohesive, I think that's been what struck me so far, because it's not just John Benton. They brought in Rick Dennison and Justin Ouden, who are all of offensive line backgrounds. I think that's a big reason Clint Kubiak got the job, is they had a lot of teaching and a lot of offense dating back to like Gary Kubiak's team with Houston in like 2010. And so seeing how good I would be pretty discouraged if they decide to break up what we've seen the last 2 weeks. And I think Sundell's athleticism and his ability to get to the second level has really caught a lot of people's attention. And some of the smart offensive line people I follow online, and they were all talking about how quick Sundell got to that second level. And so I think it would suck for him. Obviously, he got hurt and kind of got the Wally Pipp situation, but I'm expecting Sundell to win the job. And frankly, I think it's the right thing to do, unless they come out to the games and he's just way over his head. And you can always turn to Olu there. But especially for Zabel, having a guy he played with and is good buddies with, if he looked like crap in the preseason, sure, you go to Olu. But I would not be breaking up what I've seen from that interior offensive line.
Yeah, and the one play for me that really stuck out with Sundell was in this Chiefs game, and I think it was was Halani's first wide zone toss, I think going in the first quarter, and he gets like 30 yards on it again.
30
He's
yards
just gone down.
Yeah.
And you watch Zabel gets to his block, but the reach block that Sundell is able to make there and turn that 3-tech that's chasing. And I'm going, I don't know if Olu makes that block, because I don't know if his athletic ability allows him to actually beat that guy to the point and turn him. And that's kind of the thing. Like, I've seen some people say, well, can Sundell handle a bull rush and can he do this? Well, I don't think we're going to see necessarily as much straight back, drop back passing as we saw last year, which is generally when you see some of the bull rush really come into play, is when a team knows, hey, you're in this situation. We're going to go and we're going to bull rush you. I think because they'll be so play action based on a lot of things and quick game based, I don't think Sundell, I should say, sorry, will see that. And he actually is a wrestler by trade, if I'm not mistaken. Like, he had a wrestling background. So you're kind of used to dealing with those in even a smaller area in some aspects. So I personally, I've been high on Sundell since I actually saw him last year at FanFest. I watched him and I was like, who is this guy? And I was sitting with Dan Viens there and we were talking about it. And I said, this Sundell guy, this is the guy we just signed. I said, he looks like he could legitimately be a center. And we watched him through preseason. Then you watch him again last year in that Green Bay game. Charbonnet's touchdown run, who's leading him down the field is your center on a center pull play. Like, that's where I kind of was like, okay, I think there's a viable reason to think this guy could be the answer at center for Seattle. So it'll be interesting to see how it shapes up over the next 24 hours here or so. But let's talk about Klint Kubiak. Obviously, this is kind of, you touched on a little bit there, Jeff, with the staff he's brought in and everything. But do you think he can elevate the Seahawks from where they've been, let's say, over the last, I'll go back to as far as Brian Schottenheimer. I won't go to Darrell Bevel, but I'll go to Brian Schottenheimer and forward. We've kind of had this turnstile of offensive coordinators and even style of play to a point. Do you think Klint Kubiak, brings stability and can elevate the Seahawks offense as a whole?
I do. And I think a lot of people just seeing that whole first drive and seeing just how well everything married together. Like, the man of national insiders were all of a sudden be like, whoa, Klint Kubiak. And look, I thought he'd just come in, he'd be a fine average guy. Again, I was looking at this year as a year to just put in the infrastructure of a run game. But this whole last game kind of just made me thinking and started, my imagination was going, because you can see what one of my favorite teams ever was the Gary Kubiak teams with Arian Foster and Andre Johnson. And I think it was Owen Daniels, the tight end. And just the way everything always connected, they always seemed so hard to defend. And everyone spent so much time thinking about the wide receiver swap this year. And again, I think even the team has a pretty good understanding of what Cooper Kupp is at this point. But the whole just perspective of them, they went from DK to Kupp. They went from Geno to Darnold. I don't know how big that will be, especially if Torrey Horton gets going. And I don't know how important that is. I think you saw when the run and the pass and the play action and the move in the pocket connects, it's a really, really smart. It looked a lot like some of those Kyle Shanahan offenses before they've kind of expanded what they have. And so I think that can elevate the Seahawks offense. Again, I said earlier, I think the degree of difficulty on some of these plays, like getting that one where JSN does that fly route and gets into space and Robbie Utes on the play action. I think the thing we really haven't seen over the years with the Seahawks is where the run game and the pass game worked at the same time and kind of worked in conjunction with each other. Like, we saw some of this play action stuff early with Russ when they did the zone read, but we never really saw a game where the Seahawks offensive coordinator was kind of having these easy button plays. Like, the Shane Waldron offense always felt disjointed. Just, there was no rhythm. The sequencing never really made sense. There was some cool stuff in there, but it never connected. And obviously last year's Grubb was totally one-dimensional. And Shoddy had his moments where they ran the ball really well his first year, and then they became the let Russ cook. But again, it never really worked at the same time. And I think what Kubiak can do and why the scheme has been really successful historically, even like Bobby Slowick in Houston, they could never figure out the run game. It was the pass game worked, but it never married up together. And that's why he's kind of demoted and has kind of fallen off. And when the Kubiak thing was going well last year before all those injuries, they had obviously some freaks at receiver, but it married up really well. And I think Kubiak at his core wants to be like his dad. And like, I remember when Gary Kubiak went to Baltimore for 1 year, and instantly you could see like Joe Flacco, who was kind of just running that offense, how good he looked. And Justin Forsett, I looked this up the other day. I'm not, if I remember that off the top of my head, it'd be a little alarming. But how smooth the whole thing looked and how many easy button plays there were. I don't know. Look, it's not going to look like it did. They're going to have to play from behind. There are going to be some ugly games, I think, in here. But I really do think it can elevate the Seahawks because I think the whole thing ties together, and the amount of misdirection they ran and easy button plays and creativeness. I think what I heard was told was the reason McDonald hired Kubiak was they wanted to combine the run and the pass. They really wanted to have a vision, and they really have not had that since a lot of people have been Seahawks fans. Mike Holmgren, it might be since Mike Holmgren where they really had this.
That's kind of funny that you mentioned Mike Holmgren, because it's really interesting for me when I've done, my research into this offense, and I love this offense. I grew up watching the Mike Holmgren teams and Mike Shanahan in Denver and all that. It's like you really can trace this back really to Bill Walsh. And because Mike Holmgren learned from Bill Walsh, and a lot of people don't realize this, that Mike Shanahan and Gary Kubiak were on that 1994 San Francisco 49ers Super Bowl team where Mike Shanahan took over as offensive coordinator for Mike Holmgren, who left and went to Green Bay. And when that happened, the quarterback coach was Gary Kubiak. And so it's interesting to see that tree kind of, come down. And then everyone talks about Kyle, obviously, learning from his dad and, so on and so forth. And the one thing that's interesting, I think, where McVay goes a little bit differently, because we've all talked about how McVay's kind of taken what he learned from Kyle in Washington and gone differently in LA. I think it's because of McVay's background with Gruden and when he was with Gruden in Tampa Bay, and Gruden had the power gap run scheme down there. And that's what kind of he did with Michael Pittman and Mike Allstott and that whole crew. And it's really interesting because when we see what Gary did, Gary stuck more truly to what Mike had and what he learned from Mike in Houston with Arian Foster and that whole group that was there. So it's kind of interesting to see how this tree all works and how it all changes a little bit. I think, to your point, this offense will probably look as close as the Seahawks have looked to a Mike Holmgren offense, with the marrying of the pass and the run, and like that 2005 team where you saw, yes, they were really successful running the ball. They also had 2 Hall of Fame linemen on it. I understand that part, but the way the plays synced up through that offense, and Matt Hasselbeck looked, like an all-pro quarterback that year. And again, you weren't throwing to special receivers. We're talking about Joe Jaravicius on a 1-year deal, Darrell Jackson, Bobby Ingram. And the one that gets always forgotten is DJ Hackett had quite a good year there running the deep balls. Hackett. So and you had Jeremy Stevens running down, the middle and on the seams. And the other tight end that was the blocking tight end in that system was Will Heller. There's a pull for you. Will Heller, as I remember, because the only reason I remember Will Heller is because one of his touchdowns, I believe, in the NFC Championship game. But that's the last time we saw an offense that actually worked cohesively from start to finish. Because even with Bevel, and we saw what happened with Bevel. You went through the, Tavares Jackson early year, and then you get Russ, and then they start going away from necessarily the under center game to more of the zone read option because of Russ's legs. And then I think they went too far down that path, and it kind of took away from what the running game was. And then you obviously trade away Max Unger, and the whole thing falls apart anyways. And that's the point. Again, you trade away the center, and because Seattle's never figured out that position since that trade, I don't think any of the offensive schemes have really worked because of how crucial it is. It's not saying your center needs to be an all-pro, but he can't be Drew Nowak starting week 1 against Aaron Donald in St. Louis. That's just not going to set you up for any success. So, I think to your point, I think it does elevate. I don't know what that elevation looks like. And if Seahawks fans are expecting like a top 10 offense, I don't know if that will be the case. But I think what you'll see is a marrying of the offense and defense. And again, games will get ugly. This offense isn't necessarily built to come back from like 3 down scores. It's just not. We've seen that with the 49ers. We've seen that with some of these other teams. But if they can keep games within 1 or 2 scores and they can keep the running game a part of the game, I think you're going to see this offense be able to sustain drives, score on opening possessions, do things we haven't been accustomed to here in Seattle since basically Mike Holmgren in that era of football.
Yeah.
All right. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I always cite and I ask people to remember who the number 2 receiver was on some of those Houston teams, and not a lot of people can. So there's so much focus on wide receiver, and I guess that's just the way the NFL shifted. But yeah, I love those Mike Holmgren teams, and it was kind of before everyone, all these Seahawks Twitter emerged, and it was just like, it was so much fun to watch those teams in like the 2003 to 2007, the 2017 that couldn't run the ball at all. That was a ton of fun. So yeah, if the offense looks like a Mike Holmgren team, And again, you're right. They didn't have great receivers. There was more plug and play guys. And I think there was just way too much emphasis on that in hindsight. And again, there was so much time about DK Metcalf and hand-wringing about that. And I think they wanted to bring DK Metcalf back, but I don't know if that's going to have this mega crushing of their offense like a lot of people thought it would.
You know what's really sad, Jeff, is I can actually name that Texans receiver. Kevin Walter.
Kevin Walter.
That's my pull there for you today, because I was like, I know it's Kevin Walter.
I was like, do I ask him the question? Because I know the answer. And Jacoby Jones was there for a bit, but
he was there for a bit, yeah. And you know,
Kevin Walter was like the little Cooper Kupp guy, like condensed formation.
He was.
That offense was great.
Yeah, it worked just fine. You had and you had Owen Daniels at tight end. That was the other part of that offense that made it work.
Look like that.
Well, and to the point we haven't even touched on it is the tight ends in this offense now. Like, you've got AJ Barner, who I think shocked a lot of people last year from what they thought he was going to be to what he ended up being. And I even think in this preseason, from the limited action we've seen, Barner looks like he's probably still going to take another step. You've got now truly an X factor, and I say the X thing just because I know it bugs some Seahawks fans that they all demanded we get another X receiver here. Well, I think Arroyo can fill that void just fine enough if we have to split him out there. And then I think Eric Sauber plays a crucial role and might, in my opinion, be the best free agent signing, or, you know, in maybe a couple of years for Seattle, because I think his role is going to be so crucial, the blocking he does. And I think there's going to be points during the season where all of a sudden Eric Sauber might have a 4 or 5 catch game that we're not expecting for like 50 yards and a touchdown. We're all going to go, well, why don't they use him more in the offense? Like, look at what he can do. And it's like, well, yeah, but that's because everyone just assumes the dude's a blocking tight end. So they just don't expect him to leak out into the flat and take the ball for 20 yards down the sideline.
Yeah, like even in a couple of those years with Russ was in Denver, Sauber was like a solid, and he had like I remember watching the first year because we were cheering for them to lose for our draft pick, and he made an annoying amount of plays on that team, and he fits in that. Clint Kubiak became the play caller once Nathaniel Hackett kind of was. So I think he's going to be really solid, and I think you're right. Like, when I prepared for last year's draft, I actually had Barner in a lot of these mock draft simulators. But I thought he'd be like a 6th-round pick because I thought he'd be a really good blocking tight end. And that's really what I saw his kind of ceiling as, with Will Dissly's kind of future unclear. I thought, okay. And he gets taken pretty high in the 4th round. A lot of people thought it was a crazy reach. And he's one of the best picks they made in the entire draft last year. I think if they redrafted, he might be a 2nd-round pick. And so I was really impressed with kind of how good he looked as a rookie, especially in the second half of the season. And I advocated that they take a tight end in this draft very highly. And Arroyo was a guy I really liked. I liked Mason Taylor as well. I haven't heard much about how he's doing with the Jets. But I thought what this offense needs is 2 tight ends. And Sauber profiles way better as a 3rd tight end than as a 2nd tight end, which I think he was with San Francisco last year. And now all of a sudden, what they can do with these guys, and they had a lot of trouble blocking the edge last year. They lost Will Dissly, and they had Fant, and they weren't really good at blocking the edge, and they got killed in a lot of situations. That Pharaoh Brown was supposed to be this big-time blocker. He was awful. He was a huge bust. And so to get Sauber in there, who we know can play in this offense, he's been in 3 different renditions of the Kubiak-Shanahan offense, and what he can do on the edge, what he can do in space, he's a totally competent 3rd tight end, and I think he fits the group really, really well. And then what Arroyo can be as like a seam stretcher, and you see his athletic skills, I think he's going to have some trouble blocking, and he might not be this like dominant year 1 guy, but I think it really rounds out the group. And I think tight ends are going to be a huge part of this offense. I think what you can do in space, just getting these guys off play action, quick, easy throws. They're really making an emphasis for Darnold and getting the ball out quick. When he holds on to the ball, that's where he starts to get ugly. So I think having these tight ends as that fallback option, I think it's a huge deal, almost a bigger deal. Everyone kind of focused again on that receiver spot, but ignored this position group, which I think even though getting rid of Noah Fant and Pharaoh Brown, I think got a lot better.
Well, and when you look at the, you know, and the thing, again, I told a lot of my listeners to look at, when you look at this offense through the years, there's been one kind of crucial thing. The receivers are almost similar in their skill sets. Debo and Ayuk were a little bit different. That's the only variation you see, but there's one key thing you go from, you know, the 49er days with Walsh and Holmgren calling plays, and then even to Mike Shanahan. the tight end position. We're talking like Dwight Clark, and then we're talking Jones, and then now we're talking, Shannon Sharp in Denver when they went there. And then you see, with the Washington team, Jeff Reed was their, big tight end until the concussion problems hit. And then you go to Atlanta, and now I'm forgetting Hooper was the Atlanta tight end, and he had those great year there with Shanahan, and Shanahan gets Kittle, and McVay gets, Higbee, and now he gets, Gerald Everett when he had that point in time. Like there's always a tight end that's a viable option. Kevin O'Connell gets TJ Hawkinson. Like, that's where I look at the tight end and I go, that is such a crucial part to this offense. And because in a lot of ways, NFL defenses still struggle to find tight ends on in their zone coverage. Like we've seen it for years with the LOB, Greg Olsen down the seam with Cam Newton and Carolina and, all those things. And we could never cover tight ends. And we kept saying, why can't we cover tight ends? They get it forgotten about, especially when you're running this scheme where they're blocking so often. And then all of a sudden you think they're there. And we saw it even in the Chiefs game. You see the boot action and the tight end comes right back underneath the backside end. You dump it to him and he runs a royal runs for your 7-8 yards. It's like, oh, cool. Now it's 2nd and 3. We run the ball and we get a first down. And it's frustrating when it's not your team doing it because you're sitting there going, they're going to do it again. I know they're going to do it again. Here it comes again. And we've had to sit and watch McVay do it to us for years and Shanahan. So it might be nice to actually see that on our end for once. But let's kind of talk about another position group. And this one for me is where I have my one concern with this defense. And that's the inside linebacker depth concern. Like we heard obviously from McDonald that Knight's going to probably be back week 1. Jones has been in and out of, training camp with personal family stuff that's been related. So it hasn't been injury, which has been great. He looks good coming off that knee cleanup that he got in the offseason. But if one of those two guys misses, who's the next man up? And we saw what happened when we didn't have the right linebackers last year, Jeff, with Baker and Dodson. So how do you feel about this group? And do you think there's going to be potentially a move to get another guy in here that maybe is a little bit more of an established veteran player?
I'm pretty uncomfortable with the position group in general. And all offseason, like looking at their depth chart on our lads or however you research the roster, this kind of just jumped out to me really all offseason. I figured they'd address it in the draft. It wasn't a great free agent class for depth linebackers. It's usually not a position you want to hit in free agency. And we saw what happened last year when they tried that. And they just didn't do it. And I don't know if the draft didn't fall to them. This is an area where if you're a fan, you either got to be very uncomfortable like I am, or you got to give McDonald the benefit of the doubt. And McDonald's pet position is linebacker. That's where he grew up coaching the NFL. He spoke very highly of Patrick O'Connell the other day when he was talking, when this question got asked about Tyrice Knight, and they have Drake Thomas there, who they see as developmental. I think O'Connell would be the next man up. And to me, he's always felt like just like a practice squad player. But what McDonald is supposed to be here to do is really coach these guys up and get these guys up. And a lot of times, so many guys step up you've never heard of. So you really, if you're hoping this works, you got to really just have blind faith in McDonald there. I'm very uncomfortable with the spot. I see this as I'm just a big depth guy. I always think like there's so many injuries in football. If one injury causes like the whole Jenga thing to collapse, you're in trouble. On paper, it kind of looks like that. So at some point, you got to trust McDonald and see if he can coach these guys into reliable players for a couple of weeks. But I don't know, man. I don't know if I feel great about Patrick O'Connell going against Kyle Shanahan if he has to. I don't expect a move, considering they went the whole offseason. They could have easily addressed it somewhere, and they didn't.
Yeah, it's one of those things for me, Jeff, where I wonder if Schneider pulls off one of his like heading towards cut down day, like Justin Coleman kind of maneuvers we've seen where he throws a late draft pick and picks up some guy, and it's like, oh wow, like this guy's actually quite good. Because I'm in the same boat. Like I'm so worried if we lose Jones or Knight for like, and I'm not talking like a game. I'm talking like we lose him for 3 weeks. That is going to drastically affect that defense. And I get there's the conversation of, oh, well, they might play more of a dime look with Emin Wari moving into that weak side linebacker spot and some sub packages. And I'm like, that's a lot to put on a rookie. Like, and I get that he's really good and he's shown some flashes in the preseason, but it's still a lot to put on a rookie. I would be more comfortable if we see them make some sort of move, because O'Connell to me gives me, the Croyle kind of treatment, or Heath Farwell, and I'll go even farther back and go like Isaac Kazavinsky or Nico Cordavides. Like those are what I'm that guy, Jeff. I'm that guy. But that's kind of where the it gives me that feeling. Like I look at some of the teams that we had, like, when we look at that Super Bowl team in 2013, you had Bobby, you had KJ, you had Malcolm Smith, who ended up being Super Bowl MVP, but he could step in for more than one game and actually be effective as a player. And that's where I love Drake Thomas. And I see the special teams value in both Thomas and O'Connell because I think they're great special teams guys. But if we're talking about playing significant snaps in a team that should be able to compete for the division, and to your point, playing if they had to against a Kyle Shanahan or a McVay system, it does bring me a lot of concern because we saw how bad this defense functions when they don't have the right pieces in the middle at linebacker.
Yeah, that just seeing the linebacker switch last year from those guys who weren't playing the run fits right to Ernest Jones, it just remarkably changed the whole run defense. And then those coaches you mentioned, what they've made their marketer on is take advantage of the linebacker position. And the linebacker position has really changed in the NFL, where you used to be able to just get these big thumpers and kind of guys, some of the guys you mentioned earlier. Now you got to have guys who can run and cover. And so it's a lot just to have them run fits. And you saw last year, it just completely tore apart the infrastructure of the whole defense when they didn't do that right. And so, yeah, I've heard the Eamon thing, but Eamon is a pretty raw player. And I think they're going to move him along slowly. And yeah, I think that might be an area teams take advantage of this year. And he might have some games where it don't look too good. So yeah, I'm with you. I'm hoping they make a move there just for my peace of mind. But I don't know. I've been hoping all offseason.
Yeah,
hasn't come yet. So maybe they see this differently than I do. McDonald's pretty bullish on some of those guys. So at some level, you got to trust them. But I don't know, man.
it's
I see
going
a
to
big
be
red flag there.
Yeah, so do I. So let's discuss roster bubble players. Obviously, we got the final preseason game coming up and then cut down day on the 27th, I believe it is, or 26th, the evening of the 26th. Who do you think who's two guys that really stand out to you on roster bubble, and who are two guys that have surprised you that think have a shot at making this team?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think there's I don't think there's a lot of crazy positional battles. I think you can see watching the preseason, there's a big difference between the second string and the third string. And so we haven't really seen a lot of guys. I'd say that guys who are on the roster bubble, like Damian Martinez was a guy I was really excited about. And when they drafted him, I was pretty pumped. I thought he was like a 4th-round level player. They got him 7th. First preseason game looked pretty bad. He looked like he had no juice. He didn't look pretty good. Once Kenny McIntosh went down, I thought this guy's a lock to make the roster. And George Holani's looked fantastic. And when you start doing the roster numbers with 3 quarterbacks and Brady Russell, and it's like, are they going to be able to keep Holani and Martinez? I don't know. And so that's a guy who I think he's going to have a pretty good game tomorrow to make the team. And I don't know if he'll make the practice squad, but on some level, he also fell to the 7th round. So maybe. Let me think of a couple other ones. Two guys who I think are doing might be in good shape is Derek Young's a guy I didn't really think. I've always wondered what's he really bring to the table? Is it just special teams? I thought last game he looked excellent as a route runner and he looked really comfortable. And obviously, I think MVS is going to make the team. There's a lot of questions about him. I think with Torrey Horton's being a little banged up right now, I don't think he's going to get pushed off the roster. So I think they'll find a way to probably put Bobo, Derek Young, and MVS on the team. And so maybe Steven Sims gets to the practice squad. The other guy are those nose tackles. Bohanna and Peely have had really good camps, and that was a position also I was really hoping they would draft that spot. Jonathan Hankins, I don't know what's going on with him, but that was a position I was really worried about depth-wise, that if one of these big defensive tackles got injured, who's next up? And Mike Morris has been okay. It's been kind of a disappointment, but those 2 nose tackles, we saw Peely make that play on the safety. I think those guys are pushing to make the team, and I thought those guys felt more like camp bodies to me when I was kind of going through the roster. So the other one I'm not sure about is that final corner spot with Nehemiah Pritchett and some of the guys there. The guy from New Orleans we haven't seen much of, Gene Charles, and so I think that's one of the. But I think you can see from the roster, Jared Ivey's probably hoping to make a spot, but there isn't a ton of huge position battles. It's more end of roster, like you said, the bubble guys.
Yeah, for me, the 2 nose tackles, that whole Jonathan Hankins thing is so interesting to me because I think the mindset was We're going to sign Hankins. And if none of these guys hit, we know we've got a guy that can function in this system. And he can just stroll in at the beginning of the regular season. And we're not going to put him through a whole bunch, really, and just got to get him up to speed. Because it's kind of been hit and miss with the reporting on what's going on with him. Because one week, McDonald says at the beginning, oh, yeah, he'll be back really soon. And he's in the building. And then it's turned into, well, I'm not sure it's a back thing. It could be longer. We don't want to mess with it. And I'm like, is that because you're trying to figure out a way to just kind of like leave him in the abyss and hope no team realizes and do what they did with Jason Peters and sign him to the practice squad? Because now they have that veteran practice squad, right? So I think Bohanna and Peely both make this team because I think they both offer a little bit different of a skill set. They're big guys, but Bohanna's a really good athlete, and so is Peely, especially on that safety play. Like he basically ducked the two linemen and kind of shot up and was right there. I want to see Jared Ivey on this team because I think he is a player worth developing and giving some actual reps to at points throughout the season. Mike Morris has been kind of up and down. Like you've seen flashes where he looks unstoppable, and then you see him and it's like, where'd Mike Morris go? Like just it's like he's this big guy, and I'm still trying to figure out where he is on the field, right? So no, I think to your point though, Jeff, it's really interesting because I look at it and I go, like, there is a gap, and you can see the gap. But this might also be the first time I can say this in a while for a Seahawks team where if they do cut some guys, I could see teams picking up guys like back in the early Pete Carroll days where we saw like Howard and Ron Parker go off and start on other teams. It's going to be interesting to see how it all shapes up, especially that fifth cornerback spot. I also wonder how many safeties they take because I know McDonald really likes Ty Okada. You got DeAnthony Bell, who's been playing well. Jarek Reed had a better game versus the Chiefs, and so it's going to be interesting to see what they do there. I'm interested of all the breakdown of the roster construction to see how many O linemen they take.
Yeah.
Because to your point, there's 3 QBs. I think Mike Jarrell and Satawa Lamea are firmly on that roster bubble because I think Cabledew and Richmond, one, their guys Benton in that O-line group that are now in here and coaching staff wanted. And the fact that Cabledew got nicked up in the Chiefs game, and as soon as he was cleared, they shot him back in and didn't let Lamea finish his like even drive he was on. I was like, that's never a good sign from a coaching staff. If they're going to not even let you finish the drive and they're going to pull you out and put the other guy back in with the 2 group, I'm like, that's kind of a interesting tactic of things. So I think Lamea, he's really struggled this preseason, in my opinion, at least from what I've seen. I haven't really looked at him and been like, I see the same dominant, even run blocker that I saw last year, which is what he came in and kind of helped the team with in that Arizona game. I don't know if he fits this scheme as well as some people may have thought in the offseason, because I think he's better in a gap pull scheme where he can use brute force more than speed and getting to a second level kind of a thing. So I think that'll be kind of an interesting to see what happens in this Packers game. The final thing I'm going to ask you here, Jeff, and I kind of want to get your thoughts on this, is playoff potential in this wide open NFC. Because I think this really, for me, there's 2 teams that stand out as like playoff teams, and that's Tampa Bay with what Baker and that whole group is doing down there in the NFC South, because that's a very weak division, and the Eagles. I think the Eagles are still the class of the NFC, quote unquote. Obviously, they're reigning Super Bowl champs, but the NFC North looks kind of in shambles because we'll see what Green Bay looks like, but Love's coming off his thumb injury, even though it's his non-throwing hand, but they've kind of been up and down and hot and cold. Detroit, I think, is going to take a step back, and I don't mean like they're going to take a full fall off the face of the cliff kind of thing, but losing as many coaches as they did, I think is going to definitely put Dan Campbell's coaching ability as a head coach in the forefront of that team. I don't expect much from Chicago, and I think Minnesota might not be as good as people think they're going to be because of basically playing a rookie quarterback. So what are your thoughts? Where do you think Seattle ends up in this whole conference, and even for the division? Do you think the playoffs are a reasonable expectation for this team?
Yeah, I think I'd be pretty disappointed if Seattle didn't make the playoffs this year. But you're right. It is a wide open conference. So it's hard to know how many good teams are going to be. Like, everyone always talks for years about the Rams and the Niners, but obviously we see what's going on with Stafford, and we see what's going on with these. Feels like the Niners can't get through a practice without. They've had to make 2 trades already in the last 2 days, and they have some really holes in the roster. And it's not just the coaches in Detroit. They lost an All-Pro center, and they lost Kevin Zeitler, a right guard, and their interior, the way they've played, the offensive line has been such a big part of it. And you're right, Minnesota's been so reliant on free agents. And we've seen what happens with that historically. It usually after a couple of years falls apart. You need draft picks. You need to get younger. And they're bring in a whole new offensive line. There's a lot of questions. So I think Seattle can easily push for anywhere from the 3rd to the 6th best team in the NFC. They could end up as the 8th or 9th, like they've been the last couple of years. It's pretty wide open, but I think with the continuity on defense, with just the schematic improvement on offense, I don't know how good the offense will be. But for the Seahawks to have a good season, I think we really have to see Mike McDonald just become one of those dudes as a coach in the league. And I really believe in him. I think that's why I'm so encouraged about. You see the team they're trying to build, and those kind of teams are really hard to play against. Like even saw last year with the Chargers with Harbaugh, and they had no skill position talent at all. They still won 11 games, just playing that style. And Seahawks have a lot more talent, in my opinion, on defense than they do. And if some of these young guys can really take a step forward, the Seahawks roster is just really solid. Just there are questions about the quarterback, and the biggest question we all had was the O-line, and we'll see how that goes. But barring like a major injury, I think the Seahawks should be in there for one of those playoff seeds. But you're right. It's just there's so many questions across the NFC, and even Tampa, they're down 2 receivers already, and Godwin, McMillan, Tristan Wirfs is out. I love their roster. I think there's a really well-built team, but the Seahawks have a pretty good schedule this year. Not as good as San Francisco, but they play the NFC and the AFC South, which are the 2 weakest divisions in the league. I think they're going to be a good team. I think the 7.5 win total, wherever it is definitely off, and I think they're going to push for a playoff spot. And frankly, I think I'd be disappointed if they didn't make it.
So I made a really bold take, and I'll say it again. I feel if everything lines up for Seattle and they play the way that they can play, I think with this new scheme and everything, and it kind of marries itself together, I could see Seattle being like a floor 11 win team and a high of a 13 win team and really make some hay in the playoffs. I don't think they're going to be a Super Bowl team because I still think there's some deficiencies like we talked about with inside linebacker, and we still don't know what the quarterback position is going to be, but I think there's enough solid depth and roster construction with this team, and with all the other injuries in the NFC West. And I'm still waiting for the ticker to come and say Matthew Stafford is having back surgery.
No,
I'm still waiting for that to come across the ticker on NFL Network, like breaking news: Matthew Stafford out for the season with back surgery. I think Seattle really does have a chance because I don't look like I even think the Commanders may struggle just because they have an aging roster and there's a lot of pressure being put on Jaden Daniels. And everyone's like, oh, well, look what Seattle did when they had Russ in year 2. And it's like that entire roster was so young, though, when Russ was in year 2 of that and going to the Super Bowl and winning it. You're not talking about, Bobby Wagner almost pushing the late 30s and early 40s. We're talking about Bobby Wagner in his mid 20s. It's a totally different scenario. I'm going to be to the same point as you, Jeff. I'll be disappointed if this team doesn't make some noise in the playoffs and make the playoffs and have a double-digit win season, because I think you won 10 games last year with a deficient spotted roster throughout. Like they weren't nearly as deep in some spots as they are now and well-rounded, and I think you are now better suited to handle some of the ebbs and flows that we did last year, like the Minnesota game and the Green Bay game, that if they win one, and I won't even bring up the Rams game at home that we should have won, that would have changed the entirety of that season.
That was painful.
That was painful. So I'm in agreement with you. I think this team needs to be in that playoff, contention and actually make the playoff and probably win a game in the playoffs for it to be a successful year, because we've been to the playoffs how many times and knocked out in the wild card round. So yeah, no, I'm in agreement with you. And so, Jeff, I just want to say thank you so much, man, for your time. I know it's definitely a bit of a time zone change, 3 hours here, but where can my listeners find more of your stuff? I know you're over there on Real Hawk Talk, but anything else coming up for you in the near future here?
No, it's mostly I haven't been tweeting as much. I've been trying to take in all the information. No, it's mostly with Real Hawk Talk, where we do shows. I do a show with them every Saturday, and we do a one-on-one show like this in the group settings. I don't get to talk as much, and my Canadian side, I'm too agreeable. That's what I've been told. And so I do another podcast during the season with Rob Staten every Monday. And so, yeah, it's usually 3 Seahawks shows a week starting up pretty soon. So I have a young son at home. I'm curious what my schedule will be like this year, but we've been doing the Saturday show all year, and yeah, you'll catch me on with those guys at least during the season, but every Saturday for sure you'll see me, and probably every Monday with Rob.
Well, again, Jeff, I really appreciate your time here, and I'd love to chop it up with you again in the season when we talk about the Hawks. All right, Jeff, I appreciate it, man. Have a good night. Enjoy yourself, and I'll talk to you later. All right, guys, that was Jeff Simmons from Real Hawk Talk. He also hops on Seattle Seahawks draft blog with Rob Staten. Guys, that was an awesome conversation. I love that. Top to bottom, you get Jeff's insight and exactly what he's seeing from this Hawks team. Some of the guys he views there on the roster. We talked about Sam Darnold, what that could look like for this team in the QB room as, a whole going forward. And even got into a bunch with the Clint Kubiak scheme and where it comes from and kind of Jeff's view of how it can help elevate this Seahawks team. So I really hoped you guys enjoyed that discussion. I will definitely did, and we'll definitely have Jeff back on at some point throughout the season. But guys, it really will help me out if you guys can subscribe to the channel. All the links for that stuff will be down below in the description. Like the show. Click the notification button, guys. This is starting from scratch all over again for me. So click that notification button. Make sure you guys are going to be present for all the stuff that's going to be coming out. And guys, this is going to turn into a daily show, or as close to as daily show as I can do with my schedule. So there will be live post-game, live preview shows. We'll get even some watch parties going at different points. I'm part of the Seahawks Syndicate show with Brandon Kane, Dan Viens of Seahawks Forever, Mookie Alexander Field Goals. You will find this channel over on Field Goals. That ain't going anywhere, guys. So that will still be there. You'll be able to find all my work over there. I'll start writing a little bit too, which will be kind of fun. Just not even podcast related stuff, but just my observations on where the Seahawks are this season and the different things I see from games. But make sure, guys, you're tuned in. You've got all the stuff clicked on, and so that way you don't miss an episode, because this is going to be one heck of a ride, and I cannot wait to do this ride with you guys. It's going to be a lot of fun. And we'll definitely have more guests on in the future, but you're going to see more of me doing this on my own for the first little bit. And with that being said, guys, go Hawks.